North Korea has finally admitted that its troops have been fighting in Ukraine all along. Just why did they lie about the worst kept secret in Ukraine? And more importantly, why did they choose now to publicly acknowledge it? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to talk about that, plus the total disaster that is the U.S. Army's M10 Booker, and what this means about whether or not the Army is going to be able to fight and win the war of the future. Let's get into it. But first, I want to take a second and thank today's sponsor. I spend a lot of time online researching, reviewing, and fact-checking information about the Ukraine war. But that means that my digital footprints are all over the internet. And some of these footprints can include sensitive info, like my home address, phone number, even family members' names. That information is collected and sold off to anyone who can pay by sketchy people called data brokers. I want it gone. And that's where Delete Me comes in. Delete Me is a service that scrubs your data from these sketchy websites. I signed up a few months ago, and in just a couple days, they found dozens of places where my info was out on these websites. They submitted removal requests and got it taken down. And the best part is that Delete Me keeps scanning and removing my data year round, so I don't have to constantly check on it myself. It was so effective, when I showed my wife, she actually asked me to sign her up for Delete Me as well. And if you're online as much as I am, whether it's for work or just daily life, you need to protect yourself. These data brokers make it way too easy for scammers and bad actors to find your information. Delete Me takes care of that for you. Right now, get 20% off with my link at joindeleteme.com/veteran20 and use the code veteran20 for 20% off at checkout. Seriously, don't wait until it's too late. Check it out today. And big thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. Okay, so North Korea has confirmed for the first time that it's deployed troops to fight alongside Russia in Kursk. Now, this is at first blush, this looks like a non-story. This looks like a story that we don't care about. Yeah, no kidding. The North Koreans, everyone's known that they are in Russia except for total Russian bots and shills. In fact, it was helpful to identify Russian bots because they would say things like, oh, it's a lie that North Korean soldiers are in Russia at all. So why is it a big deal that they are out in public saying things on the state-run North Korean news agency, saying that the deployment of troops to Russia reflects, quote, the highest strategic level of the firm and militant friendship between North Korea and Russia? This is what I need. I need more militant friendships in my life. So it makes friendship sound pretty sick. But the fact is that there's a couple of things that have happened that I think make North Korea willing to say these things, right? And what's worth noting is that Ukrainian officials estimate that North Korea sent about 11,000 troops to Russia and about 3,000 additional troops to offset battlefield losses. And so this 11,000, what I thought was interesting is this is kind of a public acknowledgement of unrecoverable lost troops. These are KIA and wounded troops who are wounded so badly that they are unable to return to duty. And so this number reflects about a 30% casualty rate, which actually is kind of in line with what we've heard for other operations. And really, what I find fascinating is that this is actually a very high rate of attrition, given the fact that this push to recapture Kursk and North Korean troops really didn't enter the fray properly until around February. So February, March, and April, right? 90 days, you're looking at a third of their formation attrited out. This is very high and very intensive. Admittedly, some of this is probably going to be some of these casualties probably spiked and then lowered somewhat as North Koreans learned how to adapt to the battlefield. As we talked about, at the time, it was almost certain that North Korea, who was bringing in elite troops and highly trained officers, looked around at the Russian military, saw a bunch of 50 to 60-year-old men, drunks, out of shape, and thought to themselves, I'm not going to listen to these guys. We are elite warriors. Look at us. Look at these guys. They are not elite warriors. Not realizing that Russia also had its own highly fit military-age elite warriors, and because they failed to adapt their tactics to the battlefield, those warriors have been deleted. And so the North Koreans, right, I think had to go through the same power curve where they had some absolutely devastating losses in operations, went back, reconsolidated, licked their wounds, changed their tactics, and then went out to the front again. And so, but I think the real question is why? Why is the North publicly acknowledging it, and why was it important to keep it a secret before then? Well, the answer is twofold. The first reason is because the North Korean troops have achieved their strategic objectives, right? They were deployed in Kursk as part of the Russian effort to retake the Kursk region to improve their the Russian negotiating position going into these Trump peace talks, which, again, Russia has made pretty clear that it doesn't think it's necessary to actually engage in peace. It's more about extracting concessions from Trump without giving up anything of substance. But you can see that the entire Kursk incursion has been rolled back, essentially. There looks like there's some fighting around the borders. But again, this is likely simply Ukrainian positions aligning not with the borders per se, but actually with natural obstacles that just simply make more sense to try to hold, right? In a lot of cases, this border is just a line on a map, right? It's not a river or a mountain range. And so the Ukrainians really effectively don't hold any portion of Kursk. And the fact that this operation was seen as successful by the North Koreans mean that they want some credit for it. They want to say, hey, our troops have proven themselves effective in combat in some of the most intensive fighting on the globe. And they also want credit for being an ally, right? They want to say, listen, this successful operation happened. We were a key part of it. Our troops contributed to it. And look at what a strong and valiant and capable ally us North Koreans are. That is, of course, meant to contrast to the Europeans, who provide some funding, admittedly, for the Ukrainians, but have not provided combat troops, have provided some, but not a ton, not the majority of combat equipment. And so the North Koreans want to do this. They want to show particularly other authoritarian governments, to be like, listen, we are smaller than the Europeans. We are smaller than the Americans. But when push comes to shove, when you want us to show up, we will show up in a big way for you. Whereas the Americans will wish-wash on you. The Europeans have no real military power to speak of and are unable to provide military assistance. And I think this is a really interesting contrast. The other reason it's publicly acknowledged at this point is because the North Koreans have faced no consequences, right? And this is, I think, one of their biggest fears, and why the initial deployment was seen why they gave their North Korean troops fake Russian documents, why both Russia and North Korea claimed that there were no troops, that they were all just ethnically Asian Russians. The reason is because North Korea, I think, was afraid of consequences, of a backlash from the international community, that the international community would say, this is unacceptable. You're a third-party country who has entered this conflict in a direct, deliberate way. This isn't aiding a party, right? This is being a party to the fighting yourself. And again, one of the arguments that I've made on this channel, if you know anything about it, is that a lot of people go, is this conflict going to lead to World War II or World War III? And I'm like, my brother in Christ, it's already a globe-spanning conflict, right? Whether it's Russian sabotage operations in Western Europe, North Korean troops going from the Korean Peninsula to Ukraine, the war is expanding. The war has expanded to include additional countries, right? And so I think historians will look back and say this was actually the start of a larger global conflict at some scale. And look again at Russian drones, the Shahed drones. These are Iranian weapon systems that were, for the first 2 years they were made in Iran. And now they're being deployed to Russia. And why do you think suddenly Iranian-backed militias have such effective air defenses? Why are they able to shoot down 7, 8, 10 Reaper drones, right? It's because someone with a lot of combat experience in shooting down NATO aircraft is aiding them. Who could that someone be? Just make your guesses, right? So again, we in the West delude ourselves. We want so badly to live in a world that is where you can just ask politely for things, where other countries are going to be like, we're sorry, we didn't mean to violate human rights, we're so sorry. There's just been a miscommunication. They want so badly to live in this world, but 3,000 years of human history tells you that at least some of the time, dictators wake up every day and think about conquest. And I think that's the thing that the North Koreans also want public credit for. They want to say, listen, the Ukrainians are a NATO-backed, US-backed force, and our North Korean troops pushed them out. They defeated them in at least a local battle. And the South Koreans are going to look at this and they're going to say, this is part of an intimidation factor to the South. They say, listen, South Korean troops haven't fought anywhere for any reason. And so you guys have an unclear combat record, but the people that back you, our troops just defeated. And again, no one on the international community is sanctioning North Korea. No one is sanctioning China or pressuring China to get North Korea to back off. No one is doing anything about any of this, right? And I know what's going to happen. You're going to show up in the comments. You're going to at me. You're going to be like, well, Trump's putting tariffs on China. Well, there is no statement from the Trump administration that any part of these tariffs have anything to do with China's enabling of the North Koreans to engage in this kind of expansion of the conflict. This is also worth noting that when you have people who tell you that Biden was dangerously escalating the conflict. No, this is entirely an act by Vladimir Putin to escalate the conflict to a tremendous degree. Imagine if Poland sent an entire brigade, 2 brigades worth of troops into Ukraine to do fighting. The Kremlin propagandists would seethe and cope. They would rage online that this was unacceptable, a dangerous escalation, that this was crossing a red line. But when Russia does it, they face no consequences, no additional sanctions, no additional punishments, no anything, right? And this is why the North Koreans are saying, well, if there's no downsides to us taking credit for this, it only makes us look good and it only intimidates our enemies and empowers our allies, and we face no consequences in the international community. The international community couldn't give less of a shit that we've done this. Well, then let's get credit for it. Let's take credit for showing up for our friends. And again, the analogy I always talk about is the Spanish Civil War. Spanish Civil War fought in 1931 to 1933 to 1936, just a few years before the outbreak of World War II. And what's notable is that the division was between the Spanish military rebellion, right, led by Spain's generals, but supported by an explicitly fascist, right? They literally were like, we want to push out the forces of liberalism. We want to establish a monarchy, a strong central state. We want to model it on Benito Mussolini's Italy. It wasn't like a name calling. You could literally ask Franco. He'd be like, yeah, I love fascism. I am a fascist. And then on the other side, of course, was a Republican liberal democracy, right? People who, voting, a parliamentary system, right? Different parties would win different portions of the electorate. And when this Civil War started, the sides were divided almost exactly as they were in the Second World War. On the side of the fascists, you had Germany, you had Italy, you had mostly those 2 countries. And then on the other side, you had supporting the Soviet Union, you had the UK, you had France, you had the United States. But here's the key. The winners were the fascists. And the reason they won is not because the US, UK, and Soviet Union couldn't support the Republican Spaniards. couldn't support, by the way, the legitimate government of Spain against the fascist rebels, is that they chose not to. The support provided by the United States was actually mostly diplomatic. They, for example, refused to recognize the government of Franco Spain. They would offer, again, some level of diplomatic cover, some level of economic trade support, right? But it was extremely weak-willed. In fact, Spanish, but many, thousands actually, of Americans volunteered to fight in Spain. There was an entire brigade of for the International Legion of Spain fighting for the Spaniards. And this, right, the UK had comparable levels of support. The Soviet Union actually provided more robust support in the form of training, actually a lot of trainers, a lot of military material, particularly for like individual infantry formations. But critically, on the other side, the Germans provided way more support, right? And the Italians, but especially the Germans. The Germans provided an entire air wing, essentially a rent-a-air force. They provided almost total military and material support. So the fact is, it wasn't about who had the bigger allies, it's whose friends were more committed, right? It's the difference between, if you get in a bar fight, having your friends go, yeah, good, kick his ass, man, you're doing great. That's not who you want helping you in a bar fight, even if they're a big dude, right? It's like having a D1 linebacker friend who goes, yeah, good luck, bro. You got him. Don't let him beat you like that. You're like, dude, you're a linebacker. Help me. It would cost you literally nothing. And then if the person you're fighting against, maybe he has small friends, maybe they're older, maybe they're 130 pounds soaking wet, but they're scrappy and they don't need to be told what to do. And when they go to back up their friend, they throw down. Who would you rather have? 130 pounds but willing to throw hands, or the moral support of some 260-pound D1 linebacker? The answer is clear. You want the little guy who's actually going to throw hands. And that's sort of the fear here that I have, is that the West still thinks that being a D1 linebacker and applauding for your allies is the same thing as being 130 pounds soaking wet, but going out there and throwing hands. Because here's the other problem, right? And this is what happened in World War II. Is that when that 130-pound dude wins that fight, guess what? He became a better fighter. And your D1, your 260-pound buddy, he's not any better. He's still nervous about fighting. He's never thrown a punch, right? And what happened in obviously Spain was that the Germans said, yo, I don't think democracies are all that strong. I don't think these Western countries have any fight in them. I don't think they have any spine. I think we can just take whatever we want, and they're just going to take it. They let our allies just roll over the legitimate government of Spain, and they didn't do dick about it. And now they say, look at our Air Force. Our Air Force has hours, thousands of hours of combat flight time. We have seen firsthand what modern mechanized warfare looks like. And that is the core fear, right? Is that what you've done is you've empowered your enemies by doing this. You've empowered the bad guys, just like the Spanish Civil War empowered the Germans to say, listen, we put our Air Force, we put some of our officer corps, we even put some infantry soldiers into the fight. And they learned a ton about how modern war is conducted, right? And let me see if I can find the exact numbers here. God bless them. Yeah, here's all the belligerents. And you can see Republicans, this is the Republican government, and the nationalists were the fascists. But you can see, right, you notice the Soviet Union was the only country to actually show up with military support. But you can see the difference here, right? There were almost 60,000 volunteers for volunteers for the Republican side, 3,000 Soviet technicians, and about 700 Soviet pilots. Contrast this to nearly 100,000 Italian troops actually putting rounds down range for the fascists, 16,000 German troops, 10,000 Portuguese volunteers. And so the takeaway that you should have from this is that what counts is showing up. And when it came down to it, right, the fact is that the Germans and Italians were empowered by their victory in Spain. And they learned how modern war, all these lessons from modern war. They took those lessons back, they integrated them into their militaries, they reorganized their militaries, they changed the way they train and fight. And they said, listen, we never faced any consequences for this. So there is no reason for us not to turn around and not just help other fascists do this thing, but to actually do it ourselves. And that's how World War II started, through empowering these kinds of illiberal forces. And the fear is that this is playing out again, where people naively believe that symbolic support and real support are the same thing. And the West naively believes that it can simply ignore the growing ambition and power of dictatorships, of authoritarian countries. Okay, so speaking of being ill-prepared to fight and win the wars of the future, the U.S. Army, probably not prepared to fight and win the wars of the future, right? This is a thesis that I've had for a long time, but this is another core piece of evidence to it, is the M10 Booker tank, right? And the M10 Booker tank, by the way, guys, if you don't know what it is not a tank. It's called an American assault gun. It's an armored infantry support vehicle with a big gun in the front. It was made, of course, by prime contractor General Dynamics for the U.S. Army. Now, the U.S. Army said, listen, we need something called mobile protected firepower. That is to say, we want light infantry to have an armored support vehicle at the place where they fight, right? We can't wait for an armored division to show up and help our infantry forces. Instead, they said, we want something to show up and fight with the infantry on day one. And that's what they asked for with the Booker. There's a problem, right? The Booker doesn't do and can't do any of those things. What do I mean by that? Well, the answer is okay. So again, it was meant to provide the infantry brigade combat team, light infantry forces essentially, sometimes mech infantry, right? Infantry forces with a mobile protected direct fire capability to neutralize enemy fortified positions, heavy machine guns, and armored vehicle threats, right? There are supposed to be 14 of these Bookers in each IBCT, right? In order to give them, again, it wasn't meant to substitute an armored brigade, but it was meant to provide, again, the ability to bring a little bit of extra firepower to break into an armored location or a fortified position, right? Think a bunker or a trench line, something like that. But the key feature of the M10 Booker was supposed to be, well, it was supposed to do a bunch of things. It was supposed to be able to go wherever the infantry went. That meant being really lightweight. That meant being able to be dropped out of a C-130 just right alongside airborne troops. That literally you would drop the airborne unit and you would drop the tank right with them. So that on day one, minute one of an airborne operation, the crew hops in their Booker and starts slinging rounds downrange. It was totally meant to be a game-changing device, but there's a problem. One, the first is that in 2022, right, when they did the trials, remember, the Army would have asked for it probably around 2018. And this is actually a great work by Defense One, sort of a great summary, right? And even the DoD itself admits, this is the Army's chief technology officer says, this is the story of the acquisition of the Booker, of a requirements process creating so much inertia that the Army couldn't get out of its own way, and it just kept rolling and rolling along, right? This is a classic Pentagon procurement fuck-up. procurement fuck up, a program that moves so slowly it's outdated by the time it reaches the field, right? So what happened? Well, 2013, 82nd Airborne. They're like, dude, if we are going to be the brigades that fight China and Russia, we have to have something the equivalent of our Sheridan, M551 Sheridan. Let's see if we can find it. Now, the Sheridan, again, was a, in service from 69 to 77, and it was a baby tank. That's what it was. It was an amphibious light tank. Water, lightweight, right? And let's see, what did it weigh? Weighed about 33,000 pounds, right? Little gun, secondary armament, right? This bad boy. If I was a light infantry forces, I would be terrified if I saw something like that coming out of a plane. And the Army's like, listen, we want you to upgrade it. We want you to make a new one. But the 82nd said, listen, we want to be able to airdrop it from a C-130 or C-17. We want it to fight alongside our guys from day one. Right? But they said, listen, a Sheridan was never droppable out of a C-130. So they said, listen, the Sheridan was designed in 1969. Surely we can make an armored fire support vehicle that can be dropped out of a C-130, right? You just got to make it roughly the weight of 2 pickup trucks. Easy, right? And they say, no one ever asked, is this possible, right? And then somehow the Army said, well, right? Well, I don't know. The Army Requirements Council took a look at the 2015 requirement submission and said, never mind. Actually, it doesn't need to be loaded on a C-130. Actually, don't worry about airdropping at all. And a different council said, well, we don't need that requirement. It's not that important. And this is where things, they say, start to crumble, right? Because once you remove the requirement for airdroppability, it doesn't really help the infantry. It's just a main battle tank. It's just another smaller, weaker main battle tank, right? But there's inertia. The Booker program's underway. So they say, okay, well, instead of going back and saying, no, we failed to meet the thing that the infantry actually need, the actual needs requirement, the thing where they say, yo, this is what we need. This is what we need to have. It's got to come with us on the planes. And then some council says, oh, well, that doesn't seem that important. You could just have a drive up to the battlefield, right? And then more requirements come in. It says, oh, actually, it needs to use the SINGARs, a radio system from 35 years ago, right? And the Pentagon has said, we need a better new system, but we don't really have it. But we have to have it use the old system. Then they said, well, actually, we are going to buy fewer vehicles because if we bought more, we'd have to actually review the requirements. Right? So somebody knew something. Someone clearly knew that this tank doesn't really meet anyone's needs. No one really wants it, right? They say, we don't even understand why the requirements weren't updated to say that it has to be able to operate like a drone. Because, again, if we can have drones in the air, and the Army said, listen, we need to try to get more drone tech. In 2022, nobody said, hey, make sure this thing can be a drone too. Because again, it makes sense. You drop it out of an airplane with an airborne operation. Guess what, guys? Sometimes people don't make it to the ground, right? Airborne operations are kind of dangerous. And what you don't want to do is have your Booker land and say, quick, get the crew in the Booker. And they go, actually, the crew for the Booker got blown off course. We don't know where they are. Or they didn't make it to the ground. They got caught by enemy fire. You don't want to sit there and be like, well, this thing is now a 2-ton hunk of steel in the middle of our battlefield that can't do dick. Right? So the Army says, listen, you got to give it autonomous capabilities. But they said, no. This was still written in 2013 when nobody really had autonomous anything. And so you see it more and more and more. Nobody sits there and looks at this 10-year-old project. But then it gets even more insane because The Booker, they added more and more requirements, more and more survivability, more armor. And in fact, now Fort Campbell, the home of the 101st Airborne, the Booker is so heavy, it can't drive over the bridges in Fort Campbell. Because again, the bridges aren't built for heavy tanks. They're built for infantry guys and infantry vehicles. And so they turn around and they go, oh, actually, this can't even train. It's so heavy. So what is the problem? The problem is that today, would you want the Booker in Ukraine? I mean, it's better than nothing, but not by much, right? The only thing armored vehicles seem to be good for is absorbing drones. That's it. And so this idea that we're going to have a manned tank, a worse version of the Abrams, is insane, right? As they point out, the Booker doesn't have an autoloader. It doesn't have partial autonomy. It doesn't even have active protection systems that can stop anti-tank weapons, right? They say the Secretary-in-Chief are hoping to answer the question, can this satisfy the need? Guys, it can't satisfy any need. And this is what I talk about. When I talk about a U.S. military that's in fantasy land, pretending, right? Ultimately, it doesn't matter if individuals, I hear so many individual leaders in the military say the right things, right? But the bureaucracy itself is unable to deliver the most important stuff, which is the right weapon system at the right time to the right soldier. Look, the Ukrainians working in machine shops outside of fucking Dnipro can build fiber optic drones, design, field, and implement fiber optic drones in like 6 months. They saw the Russians were using them. They said, these are pretty effective. Let's do it. Let's go. The insanity, right? This channel has funded Ukrainian-designed autonomous supply drones, something that does not exist in the U.S. military. Doesn't exist. Why is it that a bunch of fucking YouTubers and YouTube viewers are fielding superior technology to the U.S. Army? Why is the U.S. Army producing outdated, useless gear to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while, again, private companies, defense startups are designing, combat testing, refining, and fielding and funding highly effective, mission-critical combat equipment? Why is their timeline in weeks, right? You're talking 16, 20 weeks to get a fiber optic drone designed and out onto the battlefield, or to get an autonomous supply drone out and onto the battlefield. And the U.S. Army has a decade, and they are powerless to simply meet basic requirements. And the answer is of course, a broken culture, everybody weighs in, and ultimately a sense that this isn't really about that there's a belief that the Booker's never going to fight. There's a belief that the Abrams systems are never going to fight. Or if they do fight, they're going to fight comically outmatched, podunk militaries, that it doesn't matter if there's some grift here or graft there. It doesn't matter if the Booker doesn't really have a battlefield role that we thought it should, right? None of those things are all that important, right? The important thing is that General Dynamics made a shitload of money. And here's the thing, the Booker, remember guys, it's a brand new tank. It's not an Abrams, which means that if you want your Booker to roll, you got to buy parts from General Dynamics. It's a subscription service, right? Parts, fuel. So they are going to have 10, 15, 20 years of sustained income from this, right? And the Booker will probably kill some insurgent, but that insurgent would have been killed just as effectively by a Toyota Tundra with some steel plates welded onto it and a 240 Bravo in the back. I hate to tell it to you, but that's a fact. And the fear, again, is that if I were North Korea, I would look at things like the Booker and say, this is the US Army's best, newest piece of tech, and the $5,000 fiber optic drones that our troops are trained to use already, they are going to absolutely tear this thing to shreds. And they're going to tear to shreds the people in it. And currently, right, if you dropped a U.S. Army infantry brigade combat team onto the Ukrainian front lines, across the battlefield from North Koreans, they would be unable to stop fiber optic drones. They would have very limited capabilities to stop reconnaissance drones. They would have limited abilities to do any of the things they need to do to win on the modern battlefield. And to the North Koreans, you think they don't think about these things? You think they don't know these things, right? You think the Chinese don't share this information with them? The fact is that the U.S. Army and the military in general has so much, is not effectively deterring other aggressor nations who are adopting and adapting to the modern battlefield and its technologies, right? The thing that should keep you awake, again, remember, guys, at the start of World War II, there was supposed to be an advanced technological deterrent, the Maginot Line. The French took every lesson from the First World War. They built the best static defenses that were possible. They said, guys, we've learned everything we need to learn from the previous war. No one who's going to fight World War II who's going to, if you were to try to fight World War I against us in the Maginot Line, we would win. The problem is they never realized that they weren't fighting World War I Part 2. They were fighting a totally separate conflict with a different set of technologies, a different set of rules, a different set of tactics. And the problem is that you don't get a second shot when you lose, right? The French were defeated. They never got to revise their tactics. They never got to field new stuff on the battlefield. They lost too badly because they were too ill-prepared on day one. And they lost to people that took the time to send their troops to the other battlefields of the world, learn those lessons, integrate them, and change their military way more rapidly than any other military was changing at that time. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you so much to all of our Colonel tier members. New videos dropping today. Bill Collier, Robin Coburn, guys, Martin Union, Cresta, Chris Gortz, Franz Carson, Lanny Petroro, Jalen Gao, our Lieutenant tier members, and of course, today's sponsor, Delete Me. Thanks, guys. See you in the next one. Cheers.